everyone. I'm Allison Sigrist. I'm a senior user experience developer here, consultant. Mostly focused on front-end design, but also, obviously, like we're saying, interaction, user experience in general. Talk about the responsive user experience. Although arguably we could say responsive is kind of a user experience thing, mostly or only, but I'm going to focus mostly on design considerations, not just visual design, but content design and interaction design, and things you should be taking into consideration when you're embarking upon responsive. So, probably seen a lot of slides with some version of these statistics. Billions and billions of wireless devices are still flooding the market. They're coming more and more. Can't really ignore the importance. The last bullet, actually, I was really intrigued by the enterprise tablet adoption, which was sort of backed up to, I was in a meeting this morning where someone in the room said, I don't ever go into a meeting anymore where there's not at least a few tablets around the table. And that's a really good point, is that it's not just for looking up that actor when you're watching TV, like pulling up IMDb and going, who is that? Like, there's actually people who are using tablets in the workplace, for real work. And saying grow by 50% a year. Now, this statistic, I didn't see an endpoint, so I guess forever.
Forever.
I don't know. For the foreseeable future, 50% a year. So that's huge.
Just over 7.4 billion. That's just a little bit more than the number of human beings on the planet right now. They're just about 7.02 billion people. And basically right now, something like a billion and a half people have smartphones, and it's expected to double again in that same time period. So, yeah, it's a lot of devices.
This is why we needed IP6.
Right.
Exactly. So, all right, so we've said, okay, we've done the mobile app versus responsive consideration, and we've decided to go mobile and go responsive. And as Alex spoke about, and I'm going to be talking about a lot of points that Alex sort of hit, sort of in a little more detail. Talk about mobile first. As we said, going from the smallest viewport, tablet, browser, to television. It's not in the picture because
it is the picture.
So conceivably. So really just surfacing the most important content in your smallest viewport, growing it out as appropriate. My focus, one of my main focuses is content. So mobile first is great, but I actually think content's really first. Before you even start designing, you have to know what you're going to put on your website. You need to know what Alec was talking about. You need to know your audience. You need to know what you want to say to them and what they need to hear from you. So you really need to examine your content if you're redesigning or even if you're sort of refining your site. And this sort of represents an example. A lot of times I think of content. I've got press releases, I've got articles, I've got some news. But really examining your content and breaking it down into these types. So a type would be an event. And in this example, the elements of your event, in your name, description, image, date, location, it can seem tedious to sort of break your content into this. But it's really important because what it does is it provides immense flexibility going forward when you're actually trying to build a site. And when you're trying to break your site up or refine it for all these different viewports, having that really granular control over your content is going to be a huge win. So even if it seems like up front, it's really like, oh, I can't look at my content like this, it's worth it. And then talk about context next. So as we discussed, not just the device, we've got the device, where's our user, what are they doing, where are they? A couple other contexts. This is sort of in terms of content, if you're sort of thinking about, there's other places where your content may be displayed. So we're not even just talking about devices, but also like different sites, you're sharing content across sites, or some more timely, your event is on a date and you don't need to show it after that date. So really considering the context and how someone's going to use something is sort of the next step to figure all that out. And then I'm going to move into some actual actual designy, a little more pragmatic consideration. So think modularly. So this goes back to that content example where you can break your content into these little pieces. And that way, a good example is this idea. So if you have this content piece, you may show like your entire event on your website, on your browser view. So then maybe on the smartphone, you're only showing like title, small blurb, and a date. Another thing with social media, that same piece of content, you can take that and that becomes your Facebook. Like if someone shares it, that same piece of content goes out and is what's on your Facebook description, which is great because how many times you're like, I'm going to share this, and you get this like, IMG 067.jpg. It's like, that doesn't say anything. You have to go and edit the thing. But if you have this blurb and it's being used, you can sort of use it everywhere. Like, you can sort of design for your content to be really responsive in that way, and responding not just to device but to actual context and all the different places it could be out in the world. Next is be flexible. This is a design consideration. It's also a personality decision, I want to say. And I probably should have put Pixel Profession underneath the be flexible. This is something that I think as we're moving into responsive is really important to consider, especially coming from traditional web design, right? You have a designer and they say, okay, we've got this beautiful comp, and here it is in Photoshop, and the fonts look like this, and this is how it's going to look. And then you go build it in HTML, and you have a Windows machine, you're using IE7. This really happened. And it was fine. Like the fonts didn't look great. I had a client, she's like, oh, these fonts are so pixelated. This is terrible. I hate the way they look. They were exactly the spec. They were the right font size. They were the right color. And it was all I could do when she said, what can I do to make these look better? To not say to her, get in your car, go up the street to the Apple store. Because, there's some things that you're not going to have control over in your design. And, I understand considerations about branding and marketing and how you have colors and fonts and logos. And those are all important. But there's a point at which you have to also realize that you need to sort of let go to, like, it's actually going to be better because is it better to have something that's pixel perfect, but when you put it into a smartphone, it becomes like what I call the Picasso site, where it's like straight, but suddenly like the eyes and the nose are all in one line, like it's not right. Or you have a site that, maybe it's not exactly pixel perfect from the design the designer made, but it looks great on the smartphone, it looks great on the tablet. And that's going to do better for you because people are going to be like, your site is awesome. I was like browsing on my Google Nexus, so that's an important consideration, just kind of be open to that. And also in terms of like supporting older browsers and newer ones too, the idea of progressive enhancement, like, you get this great design, lots of rounded corners, lots of drop shadows, looks awesome. If you're willing to say, IE7 users get straight corners, I'm not going to, that's what they get for not upgrading. and the other thing I think to bear in mind regarding design as well, and just browser support, generally, is that when we're doing this work, we're looking at every browser, right? Because we're doing this work, we want to make sure it looks great for everyone. Most people, for browsers, are only using one browser. So, like, those IE7 users aren't going to know that the corners are rounded. They're not, they're not going to sort of know the difference. So
because they'll never have seen it to begin with.
They're not comparison shopping.
I know we've been doing a disservice by creating like graphic rounded corners all this time because like really, it's not a representative of real life.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's only the clients who are doing that who are like, I looked at it in Firefox and IE, like this guy over here. I looked at it in both and it looks different. What's going on? You're like, stop doing that.
Again, because you're engaged in the process and you're in the design. But if you're just actually using the site, it's unlikely. The only time you know when that happens is when their site doesn't work at all. When the functionality doesn't work or something's really messed up, you try another browser because you're like, oh, well, I guess this doesn't work in Firefox. It's probably optimized for I better go use that. So, I mean, if you build flexibly, you are responsible and you build stuff so it will work and look, nice and adhere to the design as well as possible. You're not going to drive people to a second browser, and then you'll get that impression where they're like, your site's great, I love it. So, but it's just sort of letting go to like allow that to happen. So next, talk about some of the specific things. Yes, talk about grids. This is at the risk of sounding extremely Orwellian. People sort of say, this structure creates freedom.
We have always been at war with responsive design.
Right. Yeah. Because people are like, oh, I don't want to use a grid. Grids are terrible. I can't be free and flexible. I can't be, it's like it's not going to flow. It's going to look boxes and boxes and boxes. So this is just an example of a grid-based design and just sort of intro for how it works for non-designers or anybody. This is an example of a 12-column grid. These sort of darker stripes are your actual columns, and then these are spaces. But then the actual solid boxes here are representative of sort of content areas. And you basically sort of count up. So like here's a 12, like a grid 12, and this is a grid 7 and 5. So you can see that like there's plenty of places where the boxes don't line up with one another. but they're all in this grid. And the nice thing about this, like these are represented with pixels, but you can do them with relative units like ems. And then when you put it into a smaller viewport, your columns just get smaller, your spaces get smaller, proportions are maintained, but it just, so it's responding, but your design actually remains very much the same. Or if it doesn't, it also can be built like, oh, well, now our viewport's smaller, this box is going to fall underneath, and it collapses very gracefully. And so the grid just makes it just regular and easy to work with. And I have to say, one of the best, like, the most interesting sites I ever like built after design, it looked like, you wouldn't think it was a grid at all, but it was great because I didn't really have to, once I did the math on it, it just, everything fell into place. And we even had this thing where we were dragging, you could drag a box from the right to the left, and the columns were different sizes, but it was just like, boop, and over there, it's like, expanded, it was like, you wouldn't really know it was a grid. So again, sort of structure, but it's really flexible and sort of enables you to sort of enjoy throughout the viewports. So then the nitty-gritty media queries. This is what actually enables responsive to happen. This is code that goes in your style sheet. I don't know how many folks are developers versus just sort of learning about concepts, but essentially this is how you sort of say everything in this CSS block, all of these styles relate to one viewport, and then these are the styles for the next viewport. And the example I'm showing actually, again, is I'm showing what it has percentages and ems. And this is great because we're talking about sort of finding the breakpoints between devices. And because there's so many devices right now, there's still going to be a break. But the nice thing about this is that we say ems do relate to a number, right? So every browser has a default font size. It's generally 16 pixels. But if you say, your body's a percentage of the browser's default, in this case, I think that winds up being 14 pixels.
Yeah, something like that.
And then one M is that base font size. So 1M now becomes 14 pixels. You can kind of, do the math, and this is how wide. So there's a minimum width, minimum height for each of your viewports. You can kind of base it on the actual pixels for the device you're using, and it's a lot more flexible too, where you're not like, I have this hard break point between 468 pixels and 700 whatever. So that it's not 100% foolproof, but it's it helps a lot with especially this huge gamut of Android devices, where it's a lot more dynamic, and it's sort of this pixel dimension is based on the device you're using. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about, show you some actual wireframes we had built out for the responsive client. I'm showing them in the, Alex said, we did do it backwards. We did go browser to tablet to mobile. I'm showing them in the right order, but so anyway, so here's our mobile view. This is actually the same page. It's like, if we've scrolled down to the second half. So it's campus services. It's basically, if you want to go to Harvard, you need services of whatever, parking information, whatever, dining, where's the dining hall? So, we've got our navigation across the top. The navigation in this case was by user constituency, so students, faculty, staff. And then most popular, you figure, most popular, you want to surface that because they're the most popular. So find shuttle, etc. This, I think, looks like a little carousel, but very small and obviously a little lower down. Buttons that Harvard themselves thought were sort of their most important, and then here's your directions and a little photo. So really basic information here. They figure, like, if you're walking down the street, like, where's the shuttle? Like, where's the place I get it? You can sort of drill to it really quickly, and not a lot of like, imagery or just a little photo and stuff. Move up to the tablet. So now we're getting closer to what would be a traditional sort of desktop view. This X actually represents a large photo. Our most popular, which was there before, is now up here. There might even be a few more options. Okay.
Yeah, it's different.
I know it's different. This is. Just
between the two, between the breakpoints,
Right.
there's a change in the behavior of the content.
Yeah.
So essentially, you're progressively enhancing it as you gain more capability.
Right. So basically, with the media query, we sort of say, so like what wasn't here, recently updated was not in our mobile view. So in our media query for the smallest viewpoint, that's hidden, display none, and then sort of bring it out and say, okay, so it's all there. So it's same code base, but now we're showing it. And then we have a few more, so instead of just the headings, we had just departments about us connect. Now we have the actual items below it, so we've got a little more detail. And then,
So actually, before you, like,
yeah.
one thing about the tablets, though, that I personally find in using a lot of these sites, and you probably have the same experience, which is, and I've had this discussion with a variety of people. I remember you and I had that conversation when we were at that client I mentioned, which is, well, I mean, have you thought about the way it's going to be used on the iPad? And they said, well, yeah, I mean, there's no flash, so I mean, it works on the iPad. Like, well, yeah, I mean, it fits, but everything's really small still. I mean, remember, this is my navigation device. I still can't really use your site on the iPad very well. And I see this a lot now, and you probably have this in your experience where, yeah, you pull it up a site on your iPad or your tablet device, and sure, it all fits, and there's no flash and other things are going to break, so it's all there, but it's still basically the desktop experience.
Right.
And all the links are really small, and there's lots of really small type, and it really isn't very usable. So technically, does it work? Sure. Is it usable? Not so much.
Right.
So that's an important thing, and that's why we ended up changing this.
Actually, these became bigger 100%
Right.
across
Yeah.
because people couldn't actually grab them. It's a
Right,
good
yeah.
call. So I
Yeah.
forgot. Yeah.
Physical affordances.
So the actual menus.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, so we kind of had, as we were going through
Used
this,
to.
thinking about those physical affordances, exactly.
Just as a tip for that, if you're trying to figure out if the spacing on your site is too tight, get a Google or Nexus or another Android device. And one of the things that's really nice about Chrome on Android is that it will attempt, if you have two links that are very close together, it will actually magnify the view and present those links so you have a better chance of hitting it correctly. So essentially it brings it forward. If you see links like that happening a lot, your design's too tight for that device, and you need a breakpoint, and you need to consider changing your flow.
Yeah.
So it's a nice way to sort of use their usability system to actually determine that your design's wrong.
Right. I mean, even just upsizing fonts relative to the device. So smaller, the bigger the font.
Yeah, smaller device, bigger the font. Go figure.
You can read it. And then lastly, this was our desktop. This was the original design. So you can see the recently updated, on our previous design was below, but there's room here because this would actually be kind of silly to be 100%. It would be off in the design. So this was able to sort of come up, get a little compressed. Taking advantage of the larger. One thing, now if we're talking about getting even bigger, there is a point at which complete flexibility and growth is crazy because when you're talking about readability, especially on a content site, there's a point at which you're not going to read a line of text. It's like this long and then go back. So you have to also think about that if you're showcasing a lot of content, that you may actually still want to constrict your content to a percentage of your page just for readability's sake. So there can be such a thing as too much flexibility then. And also, so now showed you the wireframes. We're also, since we did these about a year ago, it was exactly 1 year ago today that I started here and I started working on the project. We're really sort of moving away from doing static wireframes and moving into HTML prototyping instead. Because this is all well and good, but I think there's stuff, it's just easier to see that stuff up front, like the physical affordances, and get it into a tablet, get it onto a smartphone, turn it sideways, see what happens. And then, we've had, I think it was that video site that was just sort of, things were redesigned. The HTML prototype, great. Oh, this does not work. Right. And then, redesign based on it. And you do it really early. It's not like you're actually in development and you're doing testing, you're towards the end of the cycle and you're like, oh, why did we do hover menus? We can't hover on a tablet. Stuff like that. You can surface those things really early. Right. And sometimes, the HTML you build can then be
so if you're still, right, so if you're still, it doesn't mean you may not start with something static just as a way to get ideas, but you might just paper it out. You might just whiteboard it, or you might just put up a big sticky and kind of draw some ideas out and get it that way. But with a lot of responsive stuff, we have stopped or trying to move away from doing really static wireframes for that reason. Because you put a static wireframe on the phone, you're like, okay, well, it's a static wireframe on a phone.
Yeah.
I don't really know what that's going to do for me. So at least with the HTML, to Allison's point, you can start to use it and start to see where it may or may not work.
Yeah, and even some wireframing tools like Axure, you can build an application with them. So it's still a wireframe, but you can click through and they have widgets and you can kind of approximate sizes and behavior. So stuff like that, still if you're, still wireframing. But that's about all I have.